today in the Capital show Ellie Cohanim. She is a former U.S. Deputy Special Envoy to combat anti-Semitism at the State Department, and she's also a fighter for human rights. She's an Iranian-born. She's a visiting fellow at IWF. Thank you very much, Ellie, for being in our show virtually and joining us via Zoom.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for having me.
Let me start by my first question about Iran Biden administration. You said in your article in the National Review, if the Biden administration really gets into the business of whitewashing Iranian body counts, it has its work cut out for it. Can you explain more about this matter?
Sure, Maria. So I just wrote this piece in National Review because the State Department issues an annual human rights report. And in the one that we issued last year under the Trump administration, we detailed the fact that in the last round of street protests in Iran, where millions of Iranians took to the streets to protest this illegitimate government, the regime took the barbaric step of using live ammunition to murder protesters, and there were 1,500 Iranians who were left dead, over 7,000 wounded, and the regime arrested over 20,000 others. And so this was documented in our human rights report, and the Biden administration in their most recent human rights report edited that report of our administration and lowered the number from 1,500 dead to 304.
Why they did that? What was the purpose from it?
My belief is that I think the Biden administration does not want the American people to understand the nature of the Iranian regime, which is that they are evil, and that this is a regime that's committing the most heinous human rights violations against its own people. It's also the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world, and so I think the Biden administration does not want Americans to understand what a threat Iran is, because we apparently are about to put them back on the path to nuclear weapons.
Do you think now the negotiation will bring beneficial results for the American people?
I think that re-engaging the Iranian regime into the JCPOA, what's called the Iran deal, is a strategic mistake for the United States, and it's not in our own national security interest. And the reason is some of what I just laid out, which is that Iran is the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world. It uses every dollar that it receives either to line its own pockets and the pockets of the regime's cronies, or they spend the money to fund terror. So that's the Houthis in Yemen, it's Hamas in Gaza, it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, it's Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq. And so when you look at the picture, and it's also their recent presence in Syria. And so if you look at the Middle East region, what you see is that there's this map of instability, violence, and murder of innocent civilians, and all of that points back to the Iranian regime.
This is what you said also. You said Iran's human rights violations include routine, arbitrary, unlawful killings, arrest, torture, and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, punishment, forced confessions, then gained through torture, airing of forced confessions on national media, unfair trials. So, do you think that this administration is capable to accountable this regime, or they will just make the blind eye on it?
Well, I'll tell you something, Maria. President Biden himself made a speech to the State Department in February. It was his first visit where he went to see the State Department officials. And in that speech, he said that he wants to make human rights a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy. And so if the president wants to do that, then he should be held to his own words. And that's what I did in my opinion piece, where I quoted President Biden. Because, you know, Iran has one of the worst human rights records of any country in the world. They have the highest rate of executions per capita. You just listed some of the violations that the Iranian regime commits on its own people on a daily basis. And so, again, if President Biden wants to make human rights a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy, then they should be holding the Iranian regime accountable. And the way that they could do that is they should be doing that right now. They just had the U.S. had these talks in Vienna this week with the regime. Now is the time to hold the regime accountable.
Do you think, what is the reason for stressing Saudi Arabia on this matter on human rights, and is it reasonable?
Maria, it's completely unreasonable. I'll tell you why. I'm a fighter for human rights, and this is the work that I do on a daily basis. What bothers me to no end is when I see people politicize these issues. And there are a lot of people in America, what they're doing is they're politicizing human rights, where they look at a country like Iran, where, again, there is the most vast system of surveillance by the IRGC against the Iranian people and mass human rights violations on a huge numbers level. And then what people like to do in America is pretend that's not happening, going to the extent of actually even revising the State Department's human rights reports. And at the same time, they are endlessly criticizing and coming after the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Now, no country is perfect, but let's stand up for the ideals of America. And if you stand for the ideals of America, you should be supporting the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and I'll tell you why.
Why?
Because this Saudi Kingdom is one of the most important voices of moderation in the Middle East.
Recently, the 4 years later, for the last 4 years, it's a miracle, like a miracle.
Exactly right. And I would say the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, he is a beacon of a new generation in the Middle East. He's the leader of a new generation and a new voice in the region. And he is someone who's been advocating for moderation. He's been advocating for women's rights. He's made changes in the Saudi legal system. And so he's clearly someone who should be supported, right? And so if people in the West claim that they support Western values, liberal values, then obviously they should be supporting the Crown Prince and his father, His Majesty the King.
I want to mention Steve Scalise, the Republican representative for Minority Whip. He said Biden is set to give up the leverage Trump going on Iran. Biden wants to return to that, which is the Obama-Biden-Iran strategy was a disaster, as he said. We sent the pallets of cash as they plotted terror attacks against us. So, do you agree with his point of view?
Yeah, I think Representative Scalise is exactly spot on, which is that the Trump administration launched the maximum pressure campaign on Iran. It's the strongest sanctions campaign any country ever launched on any other country in history. And so what we have done was we made the Iranians weak and vulnerable. The Iranian economy is in a tatters. Their currency is almost valueless. They have bungled the COVID response, and as we discussed earlier, the Iranian people have protested in the streets in the millions. So you put all of those factors, and what you've got right now is a regime that's weak and vulnerable, and President Biden and the U.S. has all the leverage right now in the relationship. All we have to do is use it, right? And let's be clear, the United States doesn't need Iran, it's Iran that needs the United States.
Why the U.S. administration or Biden, they make it easy on Iran? They release the Houthis from the list of terrorism. And lately I read what Irina Zuckerman, she wrote, one more sign that the Islamic Republic of Iran is not a legitimate representation of its diverse population, and that Biden's capitulation to the Tehran regime is an insult to everyone. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. I think that delisting the Houthis from the foreign terrorist organization list was a huge mistake on the U.S. part, and I'll tell you why. The U.S. State Department under the Trump administration, when that designation was made, it was made after a serious and thorough process of review. The U.S. doesn't make these foreign terrorist designations lightly or casually. So here you have an entire effort that went into making that designation. The Biden administration came in and almost overnight overturned it. And then what happened? Well, then we saw the Houthis attacking the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia over and over again. And then the State Department representative, all he can do is go on air and say that, we're really unhappy about this and we're really disappointed. They're in a bind right now because they've done this and they can't undo it.
You were working at the State Department when UAE and Israel signed, or President Trump was going through all this peace agreement. So can you tell us some news about, or special news about the role that Trump did it to make the peace agreement works in the Middle East, especially, of course, with UAE and Bahrain?
Yes, absolutely. I think that the Trump administration's approach to the Middle East was that, the president kind of threw out all the foreign policy expert class wisdom, all the efforts that people had tried in the past and that had failed. President Trump kind of put it aside, and he wanted to look at the Middle East with new lenses. And so, under the leadership of the president and senior advisor Jared Kushner and Avi Berkowitz and Jason Greenblatt and other people on the team, there was this vision for peace and prosperity plan that was unveiled, and which eventually led to the Abraham Accords. And I think that what's incredible about what we're seeing today after the signing of the Abraham Accords, well, first of all, you've got the United Arab Emirates, the leadership there, who took the first step towards this peace and normalization with Israel, and it was really a bold move, a courageous move, but a wonderful move forward for peace in the region. And Bahrain followed soon after, and then we saw Sudan and Morocco. And so what you have today, right now in the Middle East, is you have a new Middle East, right? And in this Middle East, there's really two choices for how nations can behave. Either countries can choose the path of moderation, of peace and bridge building, or they choose the path of extremism, violence, and ultimately, I think, war. And so what we see is that the Iranians are always choosing extremism, violence, and war, and it's really the Gulf Sunni Arab states that are taking the path of moderation and peace and bridge building, and what you see also with that those trends in the Middle East is that it's the failed states that are the rejectionists, right? It's Iran that's a failed state that's rejecting. It's countries like Lebanon and Iraq and Syria that are total disaster for their citizens.
You were visiting UAE, and I want to know from you, how do you see the tolerance concept? That you explore it with the people and everything around.
Well, Maria, I have to tell you, my last trip in office was actually to the Gulf, and I was so fortunate. I was in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and I was there for the Friday night of Hanukkah, and so that Friday night there was not one, not two, but 3 synagogue services and 3 candlelighting services in Dubai, and Saturday night there was this huge candlelighting menorah service with Jewish music blasting at the Burj Al Khalifa. And what I tell people who don't know the Middle East, I say, listen, the Burj Al Khalifa is like the Times Square of the Middle East. So imagine in the Times Square of the Middle East, you have this huge Hanukkah candlelighting ceremony and Jewish music concert. This is the new Middle East, and this peace that we're seeing and the people-to-people peace, it is really beautiful. It's hopeful. It's optimistic. It's what we all dreamt of one day, and we thought maybe for our children and grandchildren. And for me, it was really touching experience to see it in my own lifetime.
Ellie, I want to ask you my last question about Egypt. Do you think that stability will reign and will continue under the government or the reign of President Sisi, or do you think that the Muslim Brotherhood will be strengthened again during this new administration?
I think that we can never underestimate the terrorist threat that Muslim Brotherhood and again all these other forces that want to destabilize the region, we can't underestimate them, and so they should be held in check. And so I certainly hope that President El-Sisi, we've seen so much progress under his presidency in Egypt. I actually had the good fortune of visiting Egypt. I was invited to be there for the opening of the Grand Synagogue in Alexandria, which President Sisi and the Egyptian government spent over $1 million restoring the Great Synagogue there, and I was there for the opening ceremonies. And what you see in Egypt is a country that also is embracing tolerance. It's embracing its Jewish history, and so I was really touched. And again, we all know that President El-Sisi is good for the region, and he should certainly be supported. Maria, before we go, I also want to say, if I can, about the Kingdom of Bahrain, because I had, as part of my work, some of my proudest achievements was a groundbreaking agreement that we made with Bahrain's King Hamad Center for Peaceful Coexistence. And in this agreement, we chose to work together to fight anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and extremism. And so this was a historic, groundbreaking event. And after Bahrain's leadership in this field, we actually saw Morocco's Association Mimouna do the same with the State Department. And so I have to tell you that for me, it is an incredible accomplishment to know that I was able to be part of the team to work to bring the peoples in the Middle East together. And again, I'm so hopeful for a brighter future for all of our children.
Let me ask you, and this is my final question, as I'm Lebanese, what is the comparison between the Trump administration taking care of Lebanon and having priority for, if you can say, Lebanon file? So how we can see now the Biden administration looking up for resolving the crisis in Lebanon? Do you have any idea?
Maria, my hope is that the Biden administration, again, is able to distinguish between extremist elements, right? And those who are seeking moderation in a normal life in the Middle East. And I think Lebanon is the clearest example of that. And you can speak to this much better than I can. But I always tell people, I say Lebanon was the Mediterranean, it was the French Riviera of the Middle East in the 1960s. And it was just the most beautiful go-to destination. And look what it turned into. It's really a tragedy to see something so beautiful turn into a war zone. And again, I really just can hope that the Biden administration does the right thing and understands what the forces in the Middle East are that are just trying to wreak havoc on a region that has so much promise.
Thank you, Ellie Cohanim, for being with me, and I hope that we give some good impression and maybe hope for the people who seek peace and wish that this terrorist war will end. Thank you so much again, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for having me on.